So welcome to the 25th Annual Capital Conference. This is our social studies session. Our presenter is the contest director, Andrew Bates, and he does great stuff. He writes the test, he does lots of presentations. Being a former coach and now current administrator, he knows exactly what many of you do every day. And so Andy, you always bring a great, unique perspective to the contest, and thanks for all you do. And thanks for being here this morning.
Appreciate it. Well, first off, as we get started, go here. I think Dr. Stevens went over pretty much everything, but make sure you can go through the chat and I'll be looking there, especially at the end. I'll bring it up once I get out of the presentation, just because it's easier for me to do that besides going back and forth. But also make sure you're getting your credit as we discussed. And just before we begin, a big thanks to Dr. Stevens. He's been amazing as always, but I think it bears repeating, especially for this year. I think we all have our individual personal stories of how tough this year was, but you know, what he was able to do for us as UIL academics, I think is pretty amazing. Under the pressure and under the different constraints that kept popping up on a daily basis. So thank you for that, Dr. Stevens. All right, so this is social studies. Normally in a non-pandemic related year, I'll do 2 sessions at Capitol Conference. So hopefully if we're back together, we'll do that in the future. One's kind of beginning and one is advanced. So the beginning one just covers the nuts and bolts and a little bit of the topic for the year. And then the advanced is purely about this year's topic. So this year we're going to try and do kind of a 2-for-1. So it's a combination of those two, which is not that different than what I do at the student activity conferences. So remember those. Hopefully we'll have those going this year, which are always great for students, but for coaches too. And by then, I combine those 2 sessions. And so you're kind of getting that now, but that's also a couple months down the road. So there'll be, even though this is similar to that in structure, there'll be more information at the student activity conference because I'll have gone into the topic more myself. I'll have, you know, maybe cut some of the weeds away from it, found some little nuggets, plus more resources and just things that people have shared with me. That I'll put into that as well. So the structure will be similar, but there will be new information, relevant information at the student activity conference. So it'll be good, not just for students, obviously, but for coaches as well. Let me take a hit of the good stuff real quick and then we'll get going. So this is basically what we've got here. I'm going to combine, I'm going to go through the basics and then come back through it again. So I'll go through section 1, section 2, section 3, and then I'll come back through it through the more advanced lens. And so that's my plan here. Is it an hour and a half, Dr. Stevens? Is that what we're going for here?
Hour, give or take. You do whatever you need to cover the subject. When you see all your participants dissipating, it's probably time to wrap up.
So if it's everything I need to cover the subject, probably, you know, clear your schedule, get a babysitter. We'll be here probably done by Monday. At the latest, but I will try to go through this as quickly as possible with those constraints in mind. But the good thing is this is going to be posted, so you'll be able to go through the entire thing even if I don't get to it. But I will try to go through some of it more quickly than others. And just if you have questions, feel free to, you know, raise your hand or put it in the chat. Dr. Stevens, if you see a question in the chat, go for it, because I don't have mine up right now just because it's got my whole presentation there. So if you see something, feel free to jump in at any point. So this is who I am. If you don't know that already, the big takeaway from here, which I'll talk about again later, is Twitter is Mr. Academics. My email is abates@savinepass.net right there. I always try to respond to both. Email is good. It just sometimes takes a while because I get a lot of emails, like I'm sure most of you do. So it may be the end of the week when I go back through the 500-600 emails, and then I see that I missed one. But I do try to get back to everyone that emails me. And then Twitter, obviously, I try to use a lot to throw things out there, but I'll get to that a little bit more in a minute. How are we as far as we got a lot of experienced people? I mean, some of you I recognize, obviously. We got some newbies. What do we got here? Let me see it in the chat. I did bring up my chat finally. Figured out how to do that, sorry. Okay, we got some newbies out there, some first, second year people. So this is made for both, so that should work. But if I do go too fast on something and it's a really important thing for you, feel free to ask questions, because you actually made the effort. You're here, so I want to be able to answer those questions in real time, and not just, okay, well, I'll look back at the presentation later. So let's get started. This competition, it's been around a bit now. I used to call it's one of the newer competitions, but since I'm old, that's no longer actually maybe the best or most accurate statement. You can see here what it's done in the past. It usually alternates between a foreign topic and a domestic topic. Back when Larry McCarty was in charge and really, made this what it was. He didn't do that on purpose, but it ended up happening anyway most of the time. I do it on purpose. Every other year, I go domestic, and then every other year I go foreign, because I want to mix it up. I want us to cover all the different areas available to us. And a lot of times I'm looking for an area that hasn't shown up before. And as this contest grows and continues, obviously there's less spaces that are undiscovered, but there's still a lot out there. As you can see, we've covered a good bit of areas in both US history, domestic topics, and then of course, foreign topics, although I think there's obviously a lot still out there, undiscovered country in the foreign realm. And then next year will actually be the 20th year. So that's crazy that this topic has been around that long, or not this topic, but this contest. It's also crazy that I've been around that long. So that makes me sad, but also happy that, we're hitting that 20 years and this contest is going strong. The topics don't have to follow the same structure each year. And this year is definitely evidence of that, because it is very different than any topic I've ever done. I kind of went back to some of the structures that Mr. McCarty used to find some inspirations for what I could do with section 3. But it is definitely different, and any topic could be, could add to that list of structures that we've used. So, next year, what if we did a meta topic that was over all the topics of the past combined, or something else that would drive people insane? Maybe we don't do that. Although I did think of that for like half a second, and then I mentioned it to some people, and they wanted to murder me in my shoes. So I backed away. So as far as where can this topic go, like I said, we alternate. So next year should be domestic. Kind of cheated this year because the Olympics is definitely a foreign topic, but with the book, obviously it's an American perspective, even though it certainly covers a lot of the context about what was happening internationally, and that's why I ended up choosing it. It does have more of a US tilt to it than, say, past foreign topics. So that kind of helps people sometimes, but I do like to push a little bit and force us into areas that we're not as comfortable or familiar with, because that's what this topic is all about, exploring social studies. But next year we'll go back to domestic. As far as what we can do, I'm open to whatever for new topics. The hardest part is finding the primary reading selection, finding the book. I go through several books with each topic that we look at. Sometimes I'm like, oh, this book is great. And then I get about halfway through and I'm like, there's no way we can use that. And sometimes I read a book and go with it. And then I read 3 other books and I was like, these probably would have been better. But honestly, the biggest problem is just finding one, because it has to walk a line between approachability, so that high school students aren't completely turned off by it. They're actually going to read it and feel compelled to finish it, and then maybe even go back and look at it again, and then be academically reliable as well. And that's actually harder than you might think to find. There's stuff that's approachable for sure, but not all of it is maybe the most reliable. And then there's stuff that is just amazingly detailed and has all the information you want, and just unquestionably accurate and well-researched, but no one outside of doctoral students who helped write that book want to read it. So you have to find something that's in the middle, and that can be difficult. Sometimes I'll look for a book and I'll think, oh, this is great, and I loved reading it. And then when I go to see how available it is, there's like 2 copies left in existence because no one else shares my opinion. So it's finding those books that are accessible and available, but also reliable. So go to Twitter if you have any suggestions. Twitter polls, I like to put up possible topics. If some of you remember, Olympics actually won the poll that I put up last year. And so I went with it, even though it was very difficult to create this topic, and we'll talk about that when we get to it. But I thought it was worth it based on people's suggestions. If you go to Twitter, this is me right here. I have a poll that I put up just yesterday. I already got 25 votes. I say yesterday, I put it up like midnight, so it might have actually been today technically. These are some possible topics. I'm going to do more. These aren't like the 4 that are definitely going to, it has to be one of these, but these are 4 that I've been thinking about. Obviously, decades is always fun. We did the 50s way back there, almost 20 years ago now, with the David Halberstam book, which was amazing. Eras are always good, so I like the progressive era. But also I like to try to find something that's relevant to what's happening today. And so that's a big part of what I look for. Let me see if I can go back here and share my stuff again. This worked better yesterday when I went back and forth in between, but I wasn't in. Hold on. All right, so Twitter, make sure you check it out. I'm going to use it more and more throughout the year. It's honestly, sometimes I'll use it when I'm writing the tests, when I'm creating a presentation. And as I'm doing that, that means I'm doing extra research. So I'm going to put stuff up there that I'm actually using, and maybe even using for questions on the test. So it certainly can be relevant for other things than just topics, little historical jokes and things like that. I will put up resources. I'll ask questions, corrections sometimes, because every now and then I make a mistake. And by now and then, I mean, pretty much every day. And so I try to get those corrections out there as soon as possible, and Twitter's the best way to do that. So here we go with the contest. The contest, individual competition that up to 4 students per school can enter. I think most people understand that from a lot of UIL contests. Team competition, at least 3. It's got to be 3, can't be 2, no matter how amazing those 2 individuals are. You have to have 3. So if you got 2 superstars, grab somebody who just woke up randomly on the bus and throw them in the room, and that'll be your 3. Who advances out of district to region, out of region to state. It's going to be top 3 individuals competing, and all members of the top team, which has to be at least 3, but it can be 4. And then the wild card team, that's what we generally have. Very important when it exists. That means the top team of all the districts in the region that got 2nd place. And that's probably an awkward way to say it, but basically the best team in the region that wasn't first, they're going to make it to region. The best team in state that wasn't first in their region, they're going to make it to state. And the reason wildcard's important is, sometimes you can be in a really tough district, and sometimes you can be in a really tough region, and you're the best, 2nd best team in the state, but you don't get out of district because the first team is in your district. So wildcard's great for that. When I was coaching, we won state 3 times before we won region. So we had never won region, but we were state champs 3 times because wildcard allowed for that. Obviously, this past year we couldn't do it because of several reasons that just didn't make it feasible. But generally speaking, the wild card is something we're going to use, and it's very helpful. All right, the test itself, 45 questions, 80 total points. That's a perfect score on the objective, and we'll break it down just a little bit. The essay question, is 20 total points. So you can get 100, the perfect 100. It happens. It's rare, especially if I'm grading the essays, but it definitely can happen. I've seen it at all levels, honestly. But it is pretty rare. When I've looked back at it, some of the scores have gone down a little bit overall. I think since I took over from Larry, but I think that was because Larry was doing it for so long, people kind of understood what his questions were. And so it's taken a while for people to get the same read on my questions. But I have noticed some of the scores coming back up. All right, remember, this is something we covered, and a lot of this that we covered in the essay yesterday with the good doctor, I'll probably just fly by because it's pretty evident just by reading it. So if you want to go back and look at it, you can, but I'm not going to belabor it because we did cover it in that session. So if you have questions, you can either go back and look at this and these slides, or even better, you can go to the recorded session from yesterday, and it goes much more in depth into the essay. But you do have to submit it. It has to be a sincere effort. So again, you can't talk about your favorite Saturday morning cartoon, which obviously you're not going to do because those aren't even things anymore. So kids don't even know what Saturday morning cartoons are, but you have to answer the question in a sincere effort. If it's only 3 lines, that's fine. It's not a disqualification, but it has to be something. The top 8 objective scores are what will get the essay graded. If there's a tie, it'll be as many as we need. So if that 8th best score happens to be shared by 8 other people, then we're going to grade all 8 of those plus the 7 that were above them. So it can be a lot more than 8. I've seen it be as many as 14, I think, in a competition, but generally it is 8. This year at state, it was actually 8 for 3 or 4 of the conferences. And I think the most was 10 at state that got graded based on ties. All right, so the rankings are the individual score, which it's comprised of their objective on the multiple choice plus their essay. So whoever has the highest score there, they are ranked 1, so on and so forth. The tiebreaker, if there's a tie after that, is the essay. So there's 2 levels of that. First, it's just who got the higher essay score. So if it's someone got a total score, objective and essay of 70, and someone else got a 70, but the second person got a 15 on their essay, whereas the person A only got a 14, even though they equaled that 70, the person with the higher essay score is going to win that tiebreaker. Now, if you look at the essays and the objectives, they're all the same, then you just have a side-by-side comparison of the essays because their scores were the same. Person A got a 15, person B got a 15. The judges just have to look at them again and say, okay, which one of these is better? It doesn't change the score. The score stays exactly the same. You still have 270s or 260s or 268s, whatever it was, but one person will be placed above the other in the scoring system. So it doesn't change the score, it just breaks the tie. As far as team, top 3 objective scores, that's why you got to have 3. You can have 4, but that 4th person, no matter who it is, it can change every time. The top 3 at district could be different than the top 3 at region, which could be different than the top 3 at state. The 4th person is going to be the tiebreaker, which did not used to happen at state. They didn't used to break ties, but now they do. So that 4th person can be very important. If it's a 4-person team versus a 3-person team, and the top 3 get the same score, the team with 4th person automatically wins just because they had a 4th person. No matter what their score is, it's higher than a person that doesn't exist. So that's an important note to be aware of as well. All right, objective questions. If you look at the answer sheet here, which obviously those of you who are experienced know, but this did change a couple years ago, and it says indicating the best possible answer, okay, best possible. That's important for several reasons, but a big part of it is to let the students know if there seems to be a minor mistake or some indiscretion in the question, that doesn't mean it has to be thrown out. You just need to put the best answer. Or if there's 2 possibilities that this one's kind of right and this one's right as well, put the one that is the best option. So it may not be 2 that, or it may not be 1 is the only possible thing to be considered. There might be 2 that could be considered, but you want to put the best possible. Now, that being said, I am going to try and make it to where there's just one. And I take a lot of time. That's why Glenda gets my test late. I take a lot of time looking over these questions to make sure that it's just one. And sometimes that can be more difficult. It seems pretty obvious. And if it's a number answer to something, then yeah, it's obvious. But when you're saying some of these more qualitative questions about the best or most known or things of that nature, you have to be very specific. And so the wording takes a while to get right to make sure there's only one answer. But just in case there's two possibilities, remember it's the best answer. All right, section 1, it's going to be 20 questions, 1 point apiece. These come from the knowledge and terms, so it's people and the terms list, which we'll go over later. Part 2 is over the primary document, which tends to be a book, always has been. And so the primary document always has been, hasn't always been in section 2, I should say. That's going to be 15 questions, 2 points apiece, so a total of 30. And of course, this is the book here. I put a note on the updated terms list that has the book listed up at the top. I put that, it's been updated on the website. Glenda was able to do that for me, lickety split. So it's up there and it's in the handouts as well. But one of the things I noted below the book, if you get the paperback of this, the subtitle is slightly different. It's the Olympics that stirred the world. I don't know how the Olympics changed from hardback to paperback, from where it changed the world, and then maybe it got downgraded because it was a paperback that only stirred the world, but it is the exact same book. It's just a slightly different title. So don't be thrown off by that. And I did put that note because I had gotten a couple questions on that. Part 3, 10 questions, so 30 points again. So you got 20, 30, and 30 to get you your 80. Supplemental readings and documents and just supplemental sources in general, such as with this year, we have a film. 3 points for each question to get you your 30. This can switch as far as a couple things. It can switch as far as what's in there. This year is a perfect example of that because I've never done it this way with what's in section 3. I should say some of it I've never done. Other parts are a little more standard. And then sometimes it can switch to where the book is section 3 and the supplemental documents are section 2. That has happened before. If you've been around, it happened during East Asia. Mr. McCarty did it a couple times. It just depends on the book. This is standard. The way it is this year is the way it is most years, where section 2 is the book, section 3 is supplemental. But that can change from year to year. So if it happens, be aware. Hopefully don't break your brain just because it switches. But generally, this is how it works. All right, essay. Like I said, I'm going to blow through a lot of this stuff because we addressed it yesterday, but it all is what I feel is important reminders. That's why I left it in. I didn't use the focus on the essay because I was all about getting that objective and getting that team score. But if you're talking about getting your kids up there and really individually placing, you can't do it without the essay, okay? Team score does not have the essay. The team score is only the top 3 individual objective scores, and they may not make the top 8, so their essay wouldn't have been graded, so you can't throw that in there. But if you're talking about placing first, second, third, fourth, getting that medal, you have to look at the essay. It's a huge part of it. Also, it really shows whether or not your students understand the topic. So if you look at some of their essays and realize that they're just not getting it, that's the best way to do it. Just because they miss one multiple choice, you may not realize they're really missing the point on a particular subject. But if they have to write an essay and they can't, it becomes pretty obvious. The other thing I want to say is people always talk about the subjective nature of the essay, which certainly it is because it's being judged. But there's a subjective nature to the multiple choice questions as just as much as the essay in a lot of ways, because it's luck. There's sometimes almost 300 terms, and the one that shows up in the particular point that is asked about that particular term is kind of random. Did you look at it? Did someone else look at it? It's not that they studied anymore, that they know the topic anymore. They just happened to read that particular fact and it stuck with them. So there is some subjectivity to that as well. It's always going to be there a little bit. So, in some ways, I feel like the essay balances that because it's not luck. You just have to know this topic in general to be able to write a well-formed essay. All right, so these are some of the tips. Make sure to have that thesis, answer the question, no matter what you wish it could be. I always talk about, I had a student that they wrote an essay. It was great. One of the people judging it wanted to give them like a 19, but the other person wanted to give them like a 7. And the reason there was such a discrepancy is because they didn't really answer the question. It was about FDR and first 100 days. Well, they wrote like a biography of FDR. So it had a bunch of stuff, but it didn't really cover the first 100 days. And so ultimately, when they came to a consensus, that score got reduced significantly because it didn't answer the exact question. So make sure you do that. All right, this is what a prompt looks like in general for a UIL social studies test. It's going to be set up in these 3 ways. It's always going to have that same note to it. Then it's going to have a quote to kind of get things stirring, get people aware of where I'm coming from with this particular question, what the inspiration really is for it. And then it actually asks the question. So if you notice this here, it kind of just reminds students, hopefully they know this stuff beforehand, but it's always good to make sure that they've read it so that they know kind of where they should be going with the essay. Then you get to the quote. This was from the year that wasn't. This was from one of the essays that I think it ended up being on the region test that we used for the at-home. But it may have been the state test that we never got to use for East Asia. So you have this quote here. They can come from anywhere. You don't need to know the quote. The quote is not like, oh, I've never heard of that person, I'm not going to be able to answer that question. The quote can only help you. And it gives you some ideas here. And then from that, it asks you the specific question. Usually there's a lead-in sentence that kind of, again, sets the stage. And then it talks about what I actually want to see from the student. So that final sentence there, trace the evolution of Japan's international status from the era of unequal treaties to the end of the Meiji period. That's the actual question. It's asking a couple different things. And so everything before that kind of informs the student, and then it asks them exactly what they're looking for. So that's the structure of the essays. It's always going to be that structure. As far as this particular section, there may be a little bit more lead up, a little less lead up. The question itself may ask a little more, a little less, but it's always going to be the same structure. Okay. Perfect essay. I won't go over the rubric because we had that yesterday, but if you do want to look at this, this is a link to the rubric. We use a consensus, not an average. I say it's a hybrid because we're averaging 3 people's opinions, not their numbers necessarily, but their opinions. I hit this every time, even though we talked about it yesterday. It's not an English paper. It's meant to judge their knowledge, not necessarily their writing skills. I say not necessarily because that's just, it has to be a part of it. Human nature, it's going to be a part of it. And when you're coming down to just on a granular level, which one's better than the other, then yeah, the one that probably would have got the better grade in English is going to win out over the other, all other things being equal. But that is, that is below the importance of the actual factual content and the analysis and answering the question. All right. Blah, blah, going to pass all that. This one thing I want to hit here, and I talked about it yesterday a little bit, plan things out. Make sure, not only do I mean outline your essay so you hit everything, but make sure you have enough time to do what you need to do. So tell the students ahead of time, all right, this is how long it generally takes you to answer the questions. You take a little bit longer. So you need to know that you're thinking about writing that essay faster than student A or student B, because student B is able to get through the objective portion faster. Whatever it is, you need to help your students plan ahead, because 90 minutes seems like a lot until you're in there and suddenly there's 2 minutes left and you've got at least 2 paragraphs left of the essay and the student starts freaking out and they don't know what to put. And you don't want that, and it's avoidable. So this is a big part that I want to emphasize, even though we did talk about it a little bit yesterday. Plan out your timing, not just the essay, but the timing of how the student takes the test. This is something I always say. So for newbies, just let it percolate. That means skip to the end of the test. Yesterday, we talked about how in current events, there's a picture on the front of the test and it relates to the essay. So in social studies, we usually have the book on the cover, just always keep it the same. So flip to the back. As soon as they say go, obviously wait, but tell your students, as soon as they say go, flip to the back and read that essay. Let it percolate, let it brew, let the ideas that are in the student's mind, they're there, but sometimes it takes a while for them to reach the surface. And so you got to give it time, you got to let it breathe. And that's why you want them to read it first. Also, there are questions that could relate to it. It almost always happens in some way or another. It may be kind of indirect, maybe on a tangent. But the other thing that happens is there's going to be questions that inspire the student to think about topics related to the essay. It may not be direct, but it may just for some reason trigger something else in their mind. Maybe they learned it the same day, even though it's unrelated. It'll trigger that to float to the surface. And that'll be something that they'll be able to use for their essay. Write it down as soon as it comes up to your mind. Even though you're on question 16, tell that student, flip back to the back and write that little note down by the essay so that you can remember it when you're actually going to read it. Again, also dulls the impact because essay is a big part of it. And if it's something you don't really feel comfortable on and a student doesn't, at least they'll know that before they get to the end. And that freak out, as we call it, can kind of be dulled by the time they get there. All right. One thing on that other is just, I try to write them so there's an abundant amount of information. I don't want it to be too specific. I do try to make it specific so that you don't just write and write and write like we talked about with FDR. You just don't want it to be a biography. You want it to be something specific if it's about that person or particular event. But it also, I want to feel like there's copious amounts of information out there. Like you didn't have to read the exact book I read to write that essay. I wanted to have enough information out there. So that's the other point there. All right, just the reviews of the basics, all there. I think if you need to look back at that, feel free to do so. And now we get to what exactly is this year's topic? Dramatic pause and continue. All right, so when you look at this topic, just looking at these two maps kind of tells you a little bit about it. You know, we have where the summer games have been and we have where the winter games have been. And that's pretty limited when you consider all the different areas that it could be, especially when you talk about the summer games and the fact that there's a lot more of them, and yet they don't really cover a lot more territory. And the one place they do cover that's unique is South America. They've been in Brazil, and that was pretty recent. It just happened. And then the only other place that they really stretch out to that wasn't included in the Winter Games is Australia. I mean, obviously they dip down to Mexico as well, but that's on the same continent that they've appeared before. So they've really been restrained. And certainly if you talk about their first 50, 60 years of existence, they've been a Eurocentric event. And now they have tried to break away from that and become more worldly, become more cosmopolitan. And to a certain degree, they've definitely succeeded in that. And in some ways they haven't. I mean, the Olympic rings represent 5 continents, and one of them is Africa. And you can notice that Africa is missing from this. It's been a while. We've been doing this for over a century now, and yet we haven't had games there. Now that's for a number of reasons, political, certainly, economical as well, and also geographical, because you know there's probably not a ton. There are some places, but there's not a ton of places that are hospitable to, say, the Winter Games in Africa. But there are places that certainly could have been considered and have been considered, just have never won the vote for the Summer Games. So that's why I put these maps up here, because just by looking at where they've been, there's politics in that. And that's what this topic is about on a large part, is not just what the games are, but why they are, the way they exist. You know, what are their limitations? How have they grown and evolved? And what are they growing into? You know, you talk about being Eurocentric, talk about the presidents of the IOC. There's been one president that wasn't European, and that was so diverse, it was an American. You know, it's not exactly that different than what you're seeing here. All right, so looking at this topic, how did this develop? And I have this quote last year, pull a thread here and you'll find it attached to the rest of the world. That really is what happens. You think it goes one way and you start to pull that thread and then suddenly it goes so many other ways because a lot of things are attached to it that you just didn't realize. And again, just look at the rings there, which this is a version of the rings that you see a lot, and it has a different continent associated with each color. That's not the way Cooperton actually created it. And he kind of said no, and then sometimes he said after it was shown that way for several years that, oh, okay, maybe it is, but that's not what it represents specifically, but it still shows, you know, the fact that people have interpreted that way, that the Olympics is interpreted into political perceptions, and perceptions are a large part of our reality. Why is there 5, not 7? It's because the Americas get gypped and they only get 1 ring. That's why. That part actually is true. As to which color represents America, that could be a little different, but yeah, they only get 1. And then of course, Antarctica doesn't get represented because not a lot of sports happening down in Antarctica that I'm aware of. Maybe there's a curling tournament that I don't know about, but that's why it's not listed there. So this is different than any other topic, largely because the information out there. There is a huge, just treasure trove of information about the Olympics on the academic level. And by that, I mean made for graduate, postgraduate work. Tons of resources there. Not a lot readily accessible for high school. And that posed a challenge. And that's why I almost gave up on this topic several times, because it seemed to present itself as too difficult to find just a lot of easily accessible and reliable resources for high school. You know, in years past, the topics we've done are so mainstream and well discussed and over discussed in some ways that they're all going to show up in an encyclopedia. They're all going to show up with just tons and tons of results the moment you put them into Google. That's not the case for this topic. It's going to take more digging. It's going to take more research. And so that's why this topic is different than any others. Plus just what I used in section 3, which we'll get to as well. The picture there, those are some of the books that I've used to formulate this topic. I'll go over them more at the student activity conferences, but I just put them in there in case you want to look at them and explore them for yourself. All of them cover kind of different aspects of this topic. Obviously, we have the primary source there that talks about one specific game, but there's 2 in there that cover the whole history of the Olympic movement, not just the games, but the movement, which is what this topic is about. So remember to be aware of that and to really hit that home with your students. Rio was really a game changer in a lot of ways, as we talked about geographically, but also politically. So there's a book on that. Mexico was very different as well. I mean, it's kind of the Rio of its time as far as breaking some of the boundaries that existed, plus just so much that was happening in the world. So the context made that an interesting one. And then of course we have a book on the Nazi games, the 1936, the No Boston Olympics from just recently, a book on the boycott by the US in 1980 of the Moscow Summer Games, and also a book on doping, which is a continuing problem and comes up in this topic quite a few times. It's not a recent thing. It's shown throughout this, as one of the articles in section 3 shows. So those are some of the aspects of this topic, and they're reflected by some of the books that I used. You know, reading some of these books, every time I'd read a new one, I was like, why didn't I pick this for the main book? Why didn't I pick this for the main book? Because a lot of them are really good. But they all go to what this topic is, which is the movement of the Olympics, right? The Olympic movement, capital M, that started, depending on how you want to define it, it definitely started in earnest in the 1890s, but was going about the process of becoming a movement 50 years earlier than that. And then, of course, what is it now? How has it evolved? How has it changed? What are the struggles that it faces, some of which have existed for its entirety, and some that are more of a modern ilk. So that's what we're looking at. And the culture of the games, how has it changed? The political importance of the game. Has it become less important now that we're not in a Cold War? Has it become more important now that governments are struggling to try and focus populations or gain a platform that lasts as far as people's attention for more than a nanosecond? And so those are things that we're going to look at. Politics and sports, how they're connected. That's the crux of the matter. A riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. That's a famous quote by Winston Churchill when he was addressing Russia's response to German invasion of Poland and so on at the beginning of what would become World War II. That really does define how politics and sports are related. The IOC, the International Olympic Committee, for its entire existence, has claimed that politics are not a part of sport. Yet at the same time, the whole impetus behind creating the Olympic movement was a political one, with Coubertin trying to change the political fortunes of his home of France that had been, kind of beaten about by the Prussians and the Germans. And he said the whole reason that happened was because of sports. Germans were good at sports. England had the massive empire that they had because they were good at sports. Obviously, it breaks down even more so in some of his motivations for that were how the educational system in Britain developed into a sporting system for youth and the preparation of youth, because that made them better prepared for war. We don't want war. We think the Olympics will bring peace in his mind, but if that doesn't happen, they'll be better prepared for war. So the birth of the movement itself is tied to politics. And every time a political notion comes up, people want to separate the two, but you can't. Just if you want to think that politics don't exist in sports, I mean, just there's a story about the 1936 soccer games in the Olympics, which soccer has shown up a couple times and then was taken away a couple times from the Olympics. But there was a game between, I believe it was Brazil and Austria. It might have been Peru and Austria. But basically, it went to overtime, it went to double overtime. People stormed the field to attack the Austrians with guns, mind you, not just to push them off the field. And so they had to call the game. And then they tried to replay the game, but there was such a violent reaction to trying to replay it, because at the time, Peru had been leading Austria, that Peru cut off all diplomatic relations with Austria. They didn't just boycott the Olympics. They didn't just leave. They literally cut off all diplomatic relations. There were German companies or companies in Peru that had German names that had to change their names because they were afraid their building was going to be burned to the ground. I mean, these events have political impacts to them, whether we want them to or not. And so we want to look at that. We want to look at the importance of sport through history, how it has developed, how that has changed. That's what this topic is. The games versus the individuals is important. Some of the individuals here, we're just looking at their accomplishments because they were so legendary, they were so impactful upon the Olympics and what other people tried to do, that we're going to look at them. And then sometimes it's just going to be about the games itself or the movement itself. And this is where that debate about politics and sports really comes up, because anytime you have a boycott, it hurts the individuals. It just does. And most of these individuals are not there for political reasons. So there's a strong argument to why can't we separate politics and sport when 99% of the people competing have no interest in whatever political point you're trying to make. And that's true, but at the same time, you can't separate the politics from the event itself. It just it happens. The country that hosts it is going to use it for propaganda value. It always has happened. It always will happen. It's too big an opportunity to pass up. So there's an important perspective there that you have to be aware of, that the individuals and the games are sometimes connected and then sometimes separate. And that's a benefit and a harm to each one. The events that are going to be listed in this topic, you'll notice some of them, if you've already looked, You might look at it and say, how is that related to the Olympics in any way? And it's not sometimes. Some of these aren't related to the Olympics. The Olympics are related to them. And by that, what I mean is what happened in that particular event was so impactful and determined and colored so much of the context of that time or that era when the games took place that they were impacted by it. So you really need to know about that event, which happened completely separate from the Olympics, but was so important that its influences, its effects bled over to specific games or continuing games after that. So sometimes the events are going to be directly connected to the games, and sometimes the games are going to be connected to the event. And that'll be important to look at for this topic. All right, so now that we kind of know, what we're looking at, and I would honestly, I would love nothing more than to just talk about the Olympics for the next 3 to 4 months. But I want to cover, also how to look at this topic, what I'm going to include more specifically about this topic, types of questions, things like that, other than just, what are we looking at when we're talking about, what's going to be on this on a meta level. So I want to get to that part. Strategy, and I talk about this every year, but if you're new, this is definitely the way I think you should go about attacking this topic and attacking every topic. You go from section 3 to section 2 to section 1 because it's finite in that there's not as much in section 3. You're going to have usually just documents that are, not forever long, or a few pieces of legislation or treaties or articles, as in this case. Those are very finite. Usually less to them than the book, which of course is also finite. It's only got those 430 pages or however many it may be. And then you go to section 1, which is not as finite. It is seemingly infinite because there are so many terms, there are so many people. And remember, some of these people have museums dedicated to them. So just that one person seems infinite sometimes. So if you start with what you can kind of more easily wrap your brain around and your students' brain around, and then go from there, I think it helps. I always describe it as you build the skeleton first, then you put in those major organs, and by the end of it, by the time you make it to state, you know every single individual pore and mole and hair on that body. But before you do that, you don't want to study something hair by hair. You want to look at the basics first. You want, okay, how is this built? What are the bones? How are they connected in this topic? So that's why I suggest that. Each section has its own difficulties. Like I said, section 3 may not be simple sometimes, but I still feel like that allows you to get some basic components, and then you can build your knowledge on that. It's like, teachers are always told it's scaffolding, right? That's how you want to teach. And it's spiraling your content. You're able to come back to it, because if it's in section 3, chances are it's referenced in some way in section 2, and it definitely is talked about multiple times in section 1. So you're able to spiral that content more meaningful, or in a more meaningful way, if you start with section 3, then 2, then 1, in my opinion. Don't have to do it that way. I just think it works. Also, the math doesn't lie. Okay? Section 3 is worth 30 points. It's only 10 questions. So if you can get only 10 questions right, they've already got 30 points. So that's a big bonus there if you can cover that. And by the time you get to section 2, when you get to the book, they know some of the basics. So they remember more of the book because they know these basics. If they just read the book cold, don't know anything about it, they may not really remember much of it. But if they know the basics of the topic and then read the book, I promise you, it is going to stick with them more. And then once they start studying section 1, and they've already read the book and they've gone over section 3, a lot more of section 1, those people are going to stick with them. They're like, oh yeah, they mentioned that guy in the book. Or yeah, she was the one that had to go through that other thing in the book. Or in section 3, they mentioned that event. I remember that now. So it's going to make more of section 1 stick with you, with your students. I find this to be the most efficient way of studying. It's not just effective, I find it to be efficient as well. All right, so what exactly do we have for section 1? The list is right here. You can go there. It's located on the UIL website. Obviously, we got the people first. It's about the same people as always, a little bit less. This topic was different. Like I said, I could have gone a lot of different ways. Every time I'd read something, I was like, why don't I include this? And then every time I'd look at something I included, I'd be like, maybe I shouldn't include that, because the disparity of information available. So that caused me to have questions about which way I should go. Should I just look at individuals directly related with the Olympics? Should I try to broaden it out? Ultimately, I tried to go for a middle ground. So some of these are specific, some of them are more broad, and they provide context. So these are the people a little less than normal, but about the same. There's definitely less terms than normal. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. You guys may be like cheering that there's less, but that's a double-edged sword. I always tell people when they say, why don't we just cover like, something very small, like a cameo topic or something, or why do you cover something so large? Well, when you cover something large, then it's a lot of information, but it's surface, because you can't expect them to know like deep dives of everything when the topic's so large. But when it's smaller and there's less information or less topics or terms in this case, then you can go deeper with them. So even though there are less terms, I expect to go a little deeper on some of these than maybe I would if there were the same amount of terms as they have been in years past. Some of these, they are what they are. The term is very straightforward. So there aren't levels to go. I hit bedrock the moment I define it. But on some of these others, then I will be going a little further. For example, this term right here, African boycott of Montreal Games. There's a lot that's brought into just that. The FIFA corruption case, there's a lot just in that. So there are less terms, but there's a lot of depth to them. Lots of people, I've done that the last few years now. It's usually about 75. I think this year there's about 70. The reason I do that is people are more complex than terms a lot of times, because they have their entire life that you can talk about and draw from, not just one event that they were tied to. There are a lot of terms, but again, not as many. Always look for overlap. By overlap, I mean, if it's in section 1 and it's a term or a person, and they're also mentioned in the book, and there's also something about that issue or that person or that term in one of the documents from section 3, boom, that's a big red light. Make sure you know as much as you can about that, because chances are it's going to show up on the test. It just, odds are, that's how math works. This right here, don't worry about this. This is not how I'm going to do this. This is a slide from one of Larry's old presentations from years back. He was very specific on how he was going to break down the representation of each term and topic. I'm not going to do it like that. The way I do it is random. And by random, I get a randomizer online. I give each term a number. I give each person 2 numbers. So people are twice as likely to show up as the terms. I put the randomizer in between 1 and 350 or whatever I get as far as total numbers. And then the 20 that it pops out, those are the 20 term/people that I write questions for that particular test. I do that for Invitational A all the way through state. It's the same thing. So I randomize. I may, because, okay, well, I already asked like 2 questions on this and it picked this again. So I don't know if this is really being random. I'm going to put the one above it or the one below it on my list. So there's a little tweaks, a few tweaks to it. Or sometimes my personal biases and preferences do come into it, where I decide, you know what? I don't really like that topic as much, or we've already done something very close to it, and the next topic down I really like and we haven't used it yet. So I'm going to pick that. But generally speaking, it's randomized. As far as repeat questions, people, again, they're more complex. Events, they're more complex. So they could show up on multiple tests. If it's a term, unless that is a very important, multifaceted term, chances are if it shows up once, it won't show up again, because how am I going to re-ask that question unless I basically just copy and paste from what I already did? So people and events will definitely have a chance to show up again. Others, not as much, although it certainly is possible. Several could be used in combination. So that's how you might see terms show up again. But like I said, I try to randomize it and cover things. And so that's why sometimes they do duplicate, although it's not going to be the same question, but it may be about the same person or event. And like I said, people get 2 numbers. They're weighted twice as much as every other term. So there's going to be more people on the test, even though there's a larger number of terms overall. Section 1 questions, if you're studying this, like I said, I did the 3, 2, 1. So in the past, I always hit that last. Make cards early for the kids, which is to say, hey, put down some basic information, and then as we go, we'll add to it. As we study section 3, pull out that card about Cooperton or Brundage and say, hey, we should add this note to that card, and then keep going. Don't study them as much, but make them, and then add that pertinent information as you discover it through section 3, through section 2. And then once you get to section 1, you can fill out those cards. So that's what I mean about make the cards early, but don't worry about practicing with them until later. Section 2 questions. Again, I could have gone with a lot of books, really enjoyed several of them. Every time I read one, I'm like, why didn't I pick this book? But I thought approachability was key. This book is just very approachable. I think high school students should have no problems with this. The way it's written is compelling. This guy is a Pulitzer Prize winner. I had some brief discussions with him about his book and about some other things that he used for research that I could look for, which was helpful. And I had the same discussion with some of these other authors of the books that I showed you. And so I thought it was just perfect for that. And it is a magnifying glass, which I really like. We don't always do that. Sometimes it's a more general book, but sometimes I like to just get up close and personal, down to the nitty gritty about one particular aspect of the topic and get those finite details that you might miss otherwise. And that's what this book does. It's a magnifying glass. It's not the whole topic. So don't be confused about that. If you're new, the book is not the topic. The book is part of the topic. Sometimes the book can be more general, so it does cover more aspects, but this is just about that particular component, which is Rome 1960. And of course, it covers a lot more, which is why I went with it. Gives a lot of that context. You know, the first chapter is about the meet between the U.S. and the USSR in Moscow, that track duel that they had, and that tells you everything you need to know about the role of politics in sports. I mean, he comes out and says it. He's like, the Olympics tried not to involve politics in their sports, tried to say politics was not a part of sports. At the dual track meet, they had no such compunctions. They had no such cares, and they weren't trying to hide it. And they couldn't if they wanted. It would have been silly if they did, but they didn't want to hide it because they knew the value of sports for politics. And so that's another reason why I thought this book was good. It really drives home that point. Section 3, questions related to the documents. That's always what it's going to be. This has articles. That's a new twist. I've never done articles before. So we'll see how that goes. If you're silently cursing me right now, I'll let you get that out of the way for the articles if you've seen them. I like them a lot. It really was the best way for me to bridge that gap that I talked about between there's academic research, but there's not a lot of just encyclopedia level research available. So this kind of bridged that gap. It put that right there for the students. I looked through a lot of articles through the databases that were available. There's a lot more out there, but some of them aren't available. Some of them aren't easily accessible. So that's why I went with these. And it covers a lot of the topics, a lot of the important topics within the overall Olympic movement. And so I like that new twist. The movie, that's old school because actually I've never used a movie when making this topic, but years back, I think the last time was in 2011, maybe, we had a movie, and a couple years before that, we had a movie with the space topic and with space race and with colonization of Africa. There were a couple movies associated with those. So that's actually an old twist. So I went with that. Chariots of Fire. We'll see how that goes there. And then the games, that's kind of a standard because generally when we do a foreign topic, a lot of times it has countries because it's a particular region in the world. And so it'll have fact books on that country or sheets on that country. This kind of does that for the games where there's going to be those 10, not countries, but games that I'm going to specifically ask questions for in section 3. And so you'll need to know some of the details about those. So there's an equal chance for questions from each of these individual areas. It'll be weighted like section 1 as far as I'll randomize it. I will put a number next to each one of those, and then I'll have it pop out 10 numbers for me. And those are the questions, or those are the particular articles or movie or game that I'll ask a question about. Now, with the movie, if that pops up, there's a lot that can come from that. It's a whole movie. Same with the games. With the articles, if they pop up, obviously that's a little more limited, but that's how I'm going to do it, is I'll randomize just like I did section 1. Related to section 3, right here, and these are listed on the website where it has links underneath the book on the social studies before you get to the people and the terms. So those, don't worry about if you can't get back to these links, those are there. But this is a Chariots of Fire link, so you can study that script. You don't have to just watch the movie, back to back to back to back to back, which you can. I'm not saying you can't. It's got a great score. Everybody, dun, 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 dun. Every time I see it, I just want to slow motion. Actually, that's how I run anyway, is in slow motion. I'm very slow. But you can watch it back to back. I would probably say you want to watch it a couple times, but the script is the best as far as like studying again and again. And then the games, this is one of the websites that's going to be good for that. Go here. It's going to be a very, very long extended article that has a bunch of stuff about the Olympics. Obviously, the stuff it has about the specific 10 featured games that are in section 3 or what you want to look at. It is not limited to that. There can be stuff outside of that, but that's a great source. I will use that source when making questions, but I'll also use other sources that I've included in the links as well. And I could go outside of that, okay? Generally, I don't, but I could go outside of that. Possible essay question areas, where do I go for? How am I going to make those? Now that we looked at section 1, 2, and 3, major events, people, issues, eras, cause and effect questions are really, kind of right up my alley for writing that, or compare and contrast, trace the evolution of something. Could be a standalone term or person or event if they're that important. When you're talking about, the individuals, it's only going to be a few people that could stand alone in an essay. That have to be really significant. So it may be comparing this person to that person, or this event to that event instead. So that, again, I want there to be enough information, just an abundance of information for the students to be able to write on. So that's why you might see it in conjunction with another term or person. But I'll get more specific on that here. Key people, it's probably going to be some of these that I have listed there if it was just one person. Pierre Coubertin, Avery Brundage, just him alone, right? You could just do it. I don't know if you could do a topic on him, but man, you could go for days just asking questions about that guy. And most of it's not good, just an interesting person. But what's very interesting to me about him is his beliefs and his choices are emblematic of the Olympic movement during his life. And they go from being very acceptable and of the norm to being very out of date, anachronistic, and seemingly draconian by the end of his term. He doesn't change. He's basically the same. He is untouched by time and the world, but the Olympic movement changes around him. So it's very interesting to use him as a touchstone for this. So he could be an example that you'd see, but it doesn't have to be someone that major. It could be other people that are very important that could stand alone or might be seen in conjunction. Some of the athletes, whether they're politically important or they're just so significant to the Olympics and the development of the Olympics that you'd put them in there. Jesse Owens is both in a lot of ways. Muhammad Ali is definitely both, specifically on the political side. Remember, he was sent by President Carter to Africa to visit with several of the nations to try and get them on board with the 1980 Summer Olympic Games boycott. So, he played multiple roles politically. And then, of course, you talk about 1968 Olympic boycott movement and the human rights movement associated with that. Some of the demands that were listed specifically pertain to Muhammad Ali and having him reinstated. So, that's an example there. Nurmi is, he's just iconic when it comes to Olympic history. He's been dead for 50 years and still runs faster than I do. He's just was one of those first international heroes that the Olympics really brought into the world. And Jim Thorpe, I remember first reading about Jim Thorpe probably when I was, second grade, because even though his Olympic performance in 1912, it was still that dynamic of a performance that it's talked about even today. And of course, you have the controversy around it about being stripped. You have the amateurism conflict. You have the return of the medals. You have his indigenous roots and how that played a part in both how he got to the Olympics and the questions of whether he'd be reinstated. All those different things come into it. So he really is a great example of something that embodies a lot of this topic as well. Let me go back. Major events you want to look at as well, their relation to the games, but also, how the games were impacted by them. The Suez Crisis was not caused by the Olympics. The Olympics didn't influence it in any way, but it influenced the Olympics. Egypt, Iraq, others that dropped out of the Olympics because of it. Other teams or other countries that considered boycotts or were we going to have this if this conflagration grew? That's an aspect. The Cold War in so many different ways could be an essay topic. As it relates to the Hungarian Revolution that then impacted, some of the events in the Olympics, and Prague Spring also plays that way. You talk about, Vera Kozlovska, and her response at the Olympics to the Russian or the Soviet reaction to Prague Spring, the Hungarian Revolution and its impact on the Melbourne Olympics, and the blood in the water match, comes to play. So yeah, those could definitely be essays. The beginning of the movement, the roots of the movement, how it first started. You talk about William Pennybrooks, you talk about Evangelos Zappas in Greece, really setting the stage for Coubertin. He stands on the shoulders of them to create this movement. Without them, it would not have happened, at least not at that time or not in that way. So certainly showing how it developed. Remember when he, gives his speech, that's significantly before the Olympic movement actually starts in earnest. He gives his speech, the founding speech of the Olympic movement, and everybody kind of shrugs and says, it's not a bad idea. But they don't do anything. It takes a couple of years for it to actually get going. So it's not like he just gave a speech and it was born. There's a whole process there. And then, looking at the boycotts, any of the boycotts either together or separate could be an important topic. Scandals and controversies. What am I talking about there? We're talking about the bid scandal in Salt Lake City, but also all the bids that were before that and some since then. So that could be a scandal. Doping, whether it be just focused on Russia and Sochi and their state-sponsored doping, but also the history of doping in the Olympics. That could certainly be there. Cost and commercialism, how the Olympics almost didn't exist for a while because they were just too expensive, and they still have a lot of questions associated with them. I mean, you go to Greece now, there's a lot of white elephants in Athens from the last games that were held there, because that happens. They build these huge structures that are beautiful, and then there's just nothing left to do with them because the Olympics isn't coming back, and they just don't have a use for some of those facilities. And so that costs, Montreal being probably the best example in '76, and the Big O, that just sat there uncompleted, or the tower that sat there uncompleted forever, and they didn't pay it off for 30 years. But then also the commercialism, the Olympic partners, Coca-Cola, which has been sponsoring the Olympics for, I think, a century now. and how that has impacted things. Television, it talks about it in Rome, 1960, how that kind of was just starting, and now it brings in several $billion for each Olympiad. So that could be something. Certainly, how things have evolved and changed. Amateurism is perfect example of what one can be. The rules on amateurism. Talked about Jim Thorpe and how just because he got paid about $2 a game to play baseball, somehow that meant he was a professional in the decathlon and pentathlon, which is what his medals were taken from him for. And now, we go back to 25 years ago in the Dream Team, where you had these millionaires competing at the Olympics, and thank God, because they're the best representation of that sport, right? But some people debate that, and they want it to just be the amateurs. And it's gone back and forth as to what an amateur is, and the idea of, is it even possible? Certainly during the Cold War, there are aspects of it that were beyond unfair. So that could be something. Representation of not just at the Olympics, but in the control of the Olympic movement. We talked about being Eurocentric. We talked about different evolutions that have gone forth as far as the power of other countries. You saw in the 70s, the power of African countries after decolonization had happened. They were starting to come into their own, but also representation of women, women's events. If you notice the first picture from this presentation, that was a picture of the 1928 800-meter race for women. That was in Amsterdam. And it was the first time they had run the 800, and then they stopped for like 30 years because people got so freaked out because the women were tired. They ran 800 meters, which you should try sprinting half a mile and see if you're not tired, because I guarantee you the men at the end of the 800 meter were also very tired, as the reports of the day stipulate. But they thought the women being tired was just too much to bear, not for the women, but for the men watching. And so they got rid of it. And, we see that throughout the Olympic movement, how that changed, how it developed, how it didn't, stories of the time, misrepresentations of the time, the women were just collapsing on the field, which didn't happen if you watch the video. And, just the discussion of women in the Olympics, it talks about it in Rome, where they talk about what they're wearing and how they look, less than about, how they're doing and how they're performing. Topics within the book specifically, as I just talked about, it talks about women and their representation. It can be individuals. Riker Johnson would be a perfect example. Rudolph, certainly. Khrushchev shows up a bunch. Brundage, 100% could be a book topic, although he could be out of it as well. But also you could talk about, the Cold War in relation to David Sim, Abibi Bikala, his journey, and I mentioned down here a little bit later, Italy's recent history. The connection there could certainly be shown. Tiger Bells and their journey, obviously dealing with not just situations with racism in the United States and segregation, but also with just the U.S. Attention at the time not being on female athletes and the athletic prowess of these ladies who are obviously exceptional. It talks about in the book how track and field didn't even cover the national championships. You have a magazine that's only about track and field, and yet it doesn't even mention in a single issue, a single article about the national championship for women in track and field at that time, which goes to show you. And so that could be an example about what you might see in an essay, things that you could talk about. Cold War, certainly. The spy versus spy, trying to get people to defect, propaganda battle back and forth. Talked about television, talked about amateurism, but it could be specifically tied to the book as well. Certainly the China problem, unified German team, those could be standalone essays, or they could be tied to the book. I think those are great examples of how politics and the Olympics are intertwined inexplicably, not inexplicably, but inextricably tied together. China mainland versus Taiwan, Formosa, West Germany and East Germany, and their journey there. Biggest thing I can say is if it's in the list, which means section 1, it's in the book, if it's in the supplemental reading, section 3, all the more reason to focus. Again, big red flag. means you should definitely know as much as you can about it if it shows up in all three or two. Even if one, definitely want to talk about it and learn it. But if it shows up in all three, huge. Because chances of it being on test, great. Chances of it being an essay, probably even better. All right, so the questions. Just go through some of these examples really quick, because I think people like to see specifically, what I'm kind of looking at. Remember, the questions are set up, if you're a newbie, 20, 15, and 10. That means there's only going to be 100 terms used, even though there's significantly more than that. And it could be less terms than 100 because I might double up, as I mentioned before. So, that just limits me in some ways. There's only going to be 50 questions on the document. So, theoretically, some of these articles may never be touched, or one might be touched a lot and others just once. So there is a limitation there, but it's random. So you have to be aware of what you need, that you have to cover everything. I'm going to look for cause and effects. That's a great question that I like to choose because it's easy, but I do try to make it specific. Evolution of the involvement of people or key political events, how they changed. Person started this way, but by the end, they thought this. This event started only allowing men, but then by this Olympics, women were brought in. Those are some examples. The only time something happened, the first time something happened, those are exceptional situations. The last time something happened, this has only happened twice. That's an exceptional situation. This is the only person to ever do this, exceptional situation. Matching of individuals to where they come from, or their position, or their background, or what they thought, about amateurism, or about women being involved, or about doping, or about the Olympics being on television, or the commercialism, or whatever it may be. Where were they, or who thought this? Who best represents this? Accomplishments. I like to put a box and like 3 or 4 accomplishments, and then the student has to identify that person. The specific events, where did they happen? When did they happen? How did they start? It's issues related to the specific events. What was the main reason behind the seizure of the Suez Canal? Specific accomplishments, like I mentioned before, these are exceptional situations. This is the only person to have won 8 medals in an Olympics, although there actually are multiple people who have done that, but that's an example. Other question areas, people what they wrote or who is responsible for a particular document. Now, a lot of times this is true for section 3, not as true this year. I'm not going to ask who wrote this document. Okay, so don't worry about that. I may include that information in the question. It may say that this is written by blah, 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 but I'm not going to ask who wrote a specific article because that's not pertinent to this particular topic in the Olympic movement. The information within it is, but what's contained in a document, such as in the terms, the 2000 Commission report, the Pound Commission report, 2020 Olympic, the IOC goals, what's contained in those certainly could be context. We talked about that, certainly in specific accomplishments. Timeline kind of questions, I'll have 4 different events, and it probably won't be the LA games, the Atlanta games, something like that. It won't be that easy. Maybe it will, but it's generally, different events, and you have to put them in order. All right, so some sample questions. Don't expect anything too easy. United States set a record for the number of gold medals won at a single Olympiad in 1984, games hosted by, or in the 1984 games hosted by Los Angeles. If you don't know this, there's other careers available. If you do know this, then yeah, it's just not going to be something you see because it's a little too easy. LA, by the way, about to have the 3rd Olympics. The 3rd Olympics, what are they, Paris? Although I do love that Los Angeles gets them because it's kind of one of the best suited cities for it. That's why it keeps getting it. It doesn't financially destroy it just by hosting it. So there's a lot of benefits to that, not to mention the weather. All right, actual sample question. This is from previous tests, but it kind of gives you an idea of what a question would look like. I give a lot of context, I get a lot of information in the question, and then I ask them to fill in the blank. Okay, this is from East Asia topic, but it actually could have been from last year's topic as well, because it discussed this in the book and kind of talks about imperialism in general, because the answer here is, if you don't know, A, that is the Boxer Rebellion. Okay, so this is a good example of an event question that I would use. Now, for this year in particular, here's a sample I came up with. The boycott of 1976 games by 29 countries, led by a coalition of African nations, was in response to blank being invited to compete in Montreal. And when I went out of here, I didn't bring the chat back up. Let me see if I can bring that up. So if you know it, go ahead and put it out there. 1976 games, don't Google, stop Googling. I see some of you Googling, just why? Just put the answer in. It's gonna be okay if you get it wrong. Getting a lot of answers in here. I will tell you this, I have yet to see the correct answer put in. It is D, New Zealand, okay, which is an interesting one, but it tells you about what was happening at that time, and it's a term, but it's also it's two terms actually. This question involves, and of course, it's one of the key Olympics as well. But New Zealand, their rugby team did a tour of South Africa, so it's related to South Africa and apartheid. That's what they were actually protesting. So if you put South Africa, you're definitely on the right track, and that's why I put that in there. Rhodesia obviously is related to that as well, and was banned at the same time. They wouldn't be back until 1980 when they came back in as Zimbabwe. So this is a great example of a question that it combines a couple terms, and kind of why or what distractors I might put in, because I'm going to put stuff that's closely related. And if you haven't looked specifically at that term or those set of terms, you might go for the other at first glance, which is what most people did. Okay. Zimbabwe, I don't think in 1976 it was Zimbabwe yet. I believe that happened in 1979. I could be wrong on that, but they were not allowed back at the Olympics until 1980. All right, so none of these are examples of questions I wouldn't have. In the contested 100-meter men's freestyle final of the Rome Games, blank second place judges had Lance Larson finishing second, and blank had John Devitt, while the opposite was true for the first place judges. Okay, I will have questions set up like this, where you might have two blanks. That can happen, but I'm not going to ask you this kind of minutia. Okay. The actual answer is D here. And it is an important part of the book and is an interesting part, and actually because it relates to the telecast and CBS and how they were doing things, more than just the first and second place dispute here, but I'm not going to look for that kind of minutia. This is an example again from East Asia, nothing about like specific numbers unless they're just amazingly important stats. So if you know exactly or approximately how many warriors Hideyoshi invaded the peninsula with, great, more power to you, but these just aren't the type of questions. Although the answer is actually A, it's approximately 156,000, depending on who you ask. Some people are closer to 160. Or these, and this of course is tied to this year's talk. After the inquest into the death of Danish writer Knud Jensen, the final autopsy seemed to disappear with only a partial post-mortem report being set to the, and the actual answer is like the Danish Public Health Board. That's not that important. Now, the stuff before that is more important. And the story is important, but I'm not going to ask those kind of details. I might ask, and this would be about as detailed as it gets, and this is pretty detailed, so I might not go there, but it's about as detailed as I would get with this would be the name of the drug that he had been prescribed by the team doctor, that had been given to all of them. And then of course, another doctor came in and said, hey, it's way too hot to use that. Not that you shouldn't always use that, which apparently they were okay with. It was just too hot to use. So that would probably be about as specific as I would get. Remember, the websites are important. Go ahead and look at them. One of the things, let me move this over here. One of the things that's different about this year is the way I listed them. It's ancillary versus resource topics. I don't want to click out of this and go to it, but if you follow this link, it just goes back to the resource page on the UIL website. The resources, the top list, those are going to be much more likely to actually have questions directly pulled from them. The ancillary stuff is more of giving you a background and a great place for your kids to learn. So that's why I labeled them that way. So if they're in the resources, good chance that information could show up. In the ancillary, it might be related to something that shows up, but I'm not going to be pulling from it specifically. I will tweet resources as I find them, as I'm writing questions, as I'm doing research, because I continue to do that and will be for some time, especially leading up to the student activity conferences. So I'll tweet those out, so pay attention there. Wikipedia, it's your friend, okay? Don't be mad at Wikipedia. Check the resources, check the sources that they got that information from on Wikipedia, and if they're solid, it's great, especially this year, more than any other year. Because if you go to Britannica for a lot of this stuff, it's just not there. It's just not. Because like I said, you have to go into a pretty deep dive into academic level research, college level research to find some of this stuff. So Wikipedia is going to be your friend. Just make sure that it's properly sourced. Great courses, that's something that I talk about every year. You can get a subscription to, or sometimes you can get a trial to, and it has actual videos and lectures from college professors on topics every year. That's something to look at. And then YouTube is great always. Certain topics more than others, and so certain topics I'll give you like specific ones to look at. But as far as this topic, there's a lot of documentaries on there that you can find. The Blood in the Water match, I almost included in section 3. There's a documentary on it that I thought was really good. I think it's on Amazon Prime as well, but you might look for that Blood in the Water documentary. I liked it, almost threw it on here as an actual resource. There's others that I did as well. Icarus is on Netflix. If you want to watch that, that one is great. Got a lot of awards. It is about the doping scandal in Russia. It's about doping, but it takes a left turn and goes into the actual nuts and bolts of how they were able to swap samples and how the FSB, the new KGB, was able to orchestrate or implement, I should say, the state-sponsored doping at the Sochi Games and beyond that. It's a great documentary. Almost included that one too, but that one's on Netflix. YouTube has several. It has Olympia, if you want to watch that. Lenny Riefenstahl's Opus, if you have 4 hours to kill, comes in 2 parts. And it is great. It is the cinematography, but it's obviously it takes a while to go. But YouTube is very useful there. Other things, just to finish up, there's competitions, obviously the official district, region, state, but beyond there, invitationals are great. Those are the best ways to really see where your students are at. And as far as writing an essay, those are the best ones. It's timed, it's under pressure, it's real. Just like in the Olympics, they want to try to emulate how it's going to feel. And that's almost impossible to do because there's so much pressure at the actual event. Same way here, district, region, state has a lot more pressure, but if you can try to emulate something akin to that, you should do so, and the invitationals help. If you can't make it to some place, then you've got the virtual challenge meets, Best of Texas, so you can do those online. Those are great because again, you can compare, see where you're at, but also it's extra study information. I'll just say that these are references to go back and look at. I won't actually talk about them over and over, but make sure you do look at these. There's a lot of things that I've done in the past that we continue to do as well in my school for other, just overall, not social studies in particular, and subscribe to a provider study test. That's always, helpful because The more you do something, the better you are at it. Practice is important. Doesn't make perfect, but it definitely makes you better. Study guides can be helpful. You know, there's Hexco does some. You've got MRC is another company that comes out with stuff. UIL actually has a resource site that has those. So always good idea. Practice regularly, make sure you take advantage of that. And then, as I said, I've got other suggestions here, but if you have any questions specifically, at Mr. Academics, that's my Twitter handle. So I try to get back to people and engage on that as much as possible. It's where I put stuff out, not just polls, but information, corrections. Like I said, sometimes I misspell something, or I think I put, it's supposed to be Don Caitlin, which that's corrected now. And I put the wrong name on that. And that definitely confused some people because it's just a big mistake. But a lot of times I'll put those corrections on Twitter first because that's easiest to get to before they actually get corrected on the website. So look out for that. Any other questions? Anything else that you have, you could throw in the chat there. Great courses have, what are great courses? Those are, like I said, it's a subscription service. It's great for anything, but it's actual college lecture. They're not in the classroom college lectures. They're professors who have produced these specifically for this series. So they're well done. They have you know, some graphics and other stuff included, but they're just on a range of topics, and I love them. When it came to East Asia specifically, I watched at least 70+ hours of lectures from that site because there's just so much to choose from. But that's the nuts and bolts of it. Like I said, if you have any questions, let me know. I have a lot of information here that you can go back and look at. Plus, I'll be adding more to this, although this will be the basic structure for the student activities conferences. So make sure you tune in for those if you can, or check back at those resources. And other than that, that's what I got. So if you have any questions, throw them in the chat, and I'll feel free to answer them.
Andy, we have one that asks, how much emphasis should we put on this year's Olympics?
Okay, that's a great question. And so what I try to do every year is tie the topic to something relevant, something's happening. But if anything happens after August 1st, it's not going to be on this year's topic because we're not current events. We're better than that. No, I don't want to overlap there. I don't want to, you know, for one, things change so much. I don't want to put a question on that the answer suddenly changed. So if it happens after August 1st, which is when my list becomes like set in stone-ish, unless there's something I missed and made a mistake and have to correct it. But that's when the list is no longer tentative, and that's when the topic ends. So if they were to suddenly announce that, you know, the pandemic and the Delta variants have exploded in Tokyo and they're having to delay the games, then that could be a question. But if they announce that they're canceled on August 2nd, it won't.
How outside should we go surrounding the 1960 Olympics? Muhammad Ali, throw away his medal. Would that be covered?
That's in the book. So I don't think you'd have to go a lot further than the story that covers it in the book. Certainly there's the chance that it shows up in section 1 because Muhammad Ali is on the terms list. And so that could come up, but they actually do a pretty good coverage of that in the book. So I wouldn't expect a lot more on that specifically. On 1960, it could show up, but my plan is that I'm going to try and keep that to section 2. There's a reason I didn't include some of the people and events that are in the book in section 1. I would have if they weren't already in the book, but I wanted to keep them there. Now, if they're really important, then I went ahead and I listed them in both areas. You know, it's why you see Muhammad Ali in the terms, and he's obviously talked about as Cassius Clay in the book. But I'm going to try and keep it limited to section 2.
What about the current NCAA ruling?
You know, that's very interesting. And that's why this topic I mentioned before was so different. because I could have gone a lot of different ways with it and gone into a lot more beyond the Olympics. And I did a little bit, saw with the FIFA corruption, saw with some of the political events that aren't necessarily tied to it. Originally, I had some stuff that was even like, people who were inventors of certain sports, and I had that as a historical context. And that is a perfect example with the NCAA. They're ruling in the pending legislation in over 20 different states about the amateur status and the ability to pay, or the ability for college players to get paid or remunerated for different things, is a great example of it. But because it was so current, and because I was trying to keep the topic more centered around the Olympics, I decided not to use it. Not that I couldn't have. It's a great aspect, and I think it's a great opportunity for learning for your students in how this topic operates in general. But that's why I didn't put it on there. Is just, it was developing a little bit more after I'd had most of this down, and I didn't want to stray too far from the Olympics, although I certainly could have, but I felt like that would have been a Pandora's box, and then it would have been a totally different topic.
What about Olympedia?
So a lot of the Olympic websites, Olympedia is fine. It's got some good information. But a lot of the stuff that's sponsored by the Olympics, by IOC, has its own propaganda to it. And so you have to be aware of that. And so for some of the factual stuff, just hardcore facts, 100%. But as a be all end all, as far as understanding of an event or a person, they aren't the best, because they very much curate those articles to what they're trying to present as far as what the Olympics are about.
A lot of good chatter in the box about IOC and FIFA. So very interesting commentary.
Yeah, and that's going to lead to a lot of good discussions, I think, with students. So, I think that's a natural starting point. It's just like, hey, what happened? What's happening with the NCAA? What's happening with FIFA?
Somebody asked about the dates and places for student activities conferences. Those are still up in the air. We're not getting a lot of positive or exact what's going to be the situation for college and universities. So we're still working all that out, but we'll announce that as soon as we have something in place.
And I saw somebody said, do I only add new stuff on the tweets?
Yeah.
It's a wide range of things. It could be, I could mention a resource or a link that I already have on the list and be like, hey, this is really good, by the way, which the subtext of that is, hey, I'm looking at this resource right now as I write a question, and it's even better than I remember it being. So you should probably use it, because I'm going to go back to it again. So it'll have some of the stuff that's already mentioned. I'll just mention more details about it, and then some of it can be new.
Great. And then somebody asked about Wilma Rudolph.
Right, and that goes back to 1960. Not trying to make that too much of the topic, because it's already a third of it. It's already section 2. So I didn't want to borrow from it too much. And Wilma Rudolph was on my original list of terms, as were a lot of people that were in that are talked about in that book. But then I pared it down just to try and keep that there and spread some of the attention onto other things.
Great. I think I tried to get everything in the chat box. If I missed something somebody wanted to know, feel free to unmute, speak up. Those weren't all my questions, by the way, Andy. Those were from the chat box.
Yeah, I just thought you were really interested. I was like, wow, Dr. Stevens is really into the Olympics.
Only I were that smart.
I'm loving this. Hey, just one more plug. People, go ahead and check out Twitter. I'm looking at it right now, because that poll, I'm always interested to see what people think about different topics. Like I said, this was one of the winning poll selections from last year, the Olympics topic. And so I'm always looking for suggestions, certainly on books as well, not just the topic, but a primary reading source, because those are really tough to find sometimes. So feel free to email that or tweet it and take part in the polls. Right now, the 1970s, which I knew it would, is leading the poll. The only thing I worry about the 1970s is there's still a lot of people alive that lived in the 1970s, and I'm going to put questions like, well, why didn't you do this when I was a kid? This was really, and I know that's going to happen, but that also is a great topic. So I may suffer through it anyway.
Find a book about Studio 54. Is that the plan?
We got it. It's already set. There it is. That's the book.
All right. Well, I'm gonna thanks for your presentation. I'm gonna stop the recording now.